Saigon, one of my favorite. One of my favorite. And I don't know if the people are aware, but Saigon is also a student of Eddie Ellis, student of the non-traditional approach to criminal justice. He's part of the Resurrection Study Group, as was his mentor and friend, um, who recently passed away, Sharif. So rest in peace, and our thoughts to his family still, who was also mentored by Eddie Ellis. So we have Khalil on the phone, and I want to apologize, Khalil, I didn't get you on a little earlier, but I wanted to spend some time with Glenn for the first half and then have you on, and I hope that's okay, but I'm glad that you're on. Khalil, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you for having me, and no worries, I probably better utilize the time listening to Glenn anyway.
You're old head for On Account. You're old head. We've heard your voice before. No, but I'm glad that you're on, and I really appreciate it. But I definitely wanted to get your input, your analysis, and experience regarding criminal justice reform, and your work with Just Leadership USA, as well as your work at the Legal Action Center. So why don't we begin by some of your expertise? So those of us who are on the account, we know the experience that you went through, regarding the immigration situation, and you being reincarcerated through immigration and that whole thing, and then coming home, which was a blessing. But then even after that was not the end for you. You've continued to be an advocate and a voice regarding the connections between, criminal justice, and immigration, and also, the interactions within regarding systemic racism and classism and that kind of stuff. So why don't you talk a little bit about, that work post, release from immigration, and that work that you've been doing?
Sure. So on May 8th, 2014, a little bit over a year ago, my wife and I got a knock on the door. It was around 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was what appeared to be police officers. And as someone who has had experience with the criminal justice system and who has lived a regular life after incarceration, having a police officer at the door, while it does present some form of anxiety, I very much felt like I didn't have anything to hide. So when they asked to come in, they had a few questions that they were conducting an investigation. My wife and I, sure, right? I mean, we don't have anything to hide. So we let them in. And it was in our living room with our two daughters sleeping in their bedroom that they told us the real reason that they were there, that they were really there for me, that they were there to arrest me, and bring me to immigration detention because of my conviction at that point, which was well over a year ago. Now, I was 1 week away from completing a graduate degree. I was on the precipice of entering a new chapter of my life, not only with re-entry post-incarceration, but also educationally, professionally, and so on and so forth. So, this was very much a blow for me as a person, as someone who struggled and fought and dug in and really worked really hard to rebuild a legacy for myself. And, to have someone just drag you back into a system that is hell-bent on punishment, as Glenn had mentioned, was just devastating for me, for my family, and ultimately for the community that I serve, that I work with. So, we pushed really hard, and on October 10th, 2014, a little bit over 5 months after my detention began, I was ultimately released by the government. And, very much in the same manner that I questioned what were my next steps when I was released from incarceration from the New York State Department of Corrections, I found myself very much in the same position, and I asked myself again, what will you do with this opportunity? Because the reality is that Khalil is no one exceptional. And while there are people that will tell that narrative, I always believe that it's important to highlight that there are many other Khalils, that there are people in the prison system, there are people in immigration detention that have the same exact story as I do. And the only difference is that they didn't have access to the resources that I had access to. And so how do we make my story the rule and not the exception? So that's the space that I found myself in. I had founded a company called Kinetic Solutions a little bit over 3 years prior. So when I came home, that's kind of like the work that I picked up. And obviously I was still connected to the issues and learning a lot more about the intersection of immigration and criminal justice. And then ultimately, I got involved in Just Leadership. I knew Glenn Martin when he was at Fortune Society. I was very fortunate to work with on a project a little bit over 4 months after my release, where we gave out 700 book bags in West Harlem with money that was strictly from people who were incarcerated at Greenhaven Correctional Facility. So these men raised money, donated thousands of dollars to give out book bags in a community that has been not only heavily impacted by mass incarceration, but also other socioeconomic issues that led to mass incarceration. And when Glenn told me that he was starting an organization that was going to focus on empowering the people who are closest to the problem to put them in the position to be closest to the solution, I said, you know, sign up.
Yeah.
And I came out of immigration detention in October, and they started taking applications very shortly thereafter. I was very fortunate enough to survive the very rigorous application process, and I was chosen as one of the first 20 members in the inaugural cohort of what is called the Leading with Convictions. And, you know, that very much began a different chapter of my life, because for the first time as a professional, as someone who had survived incarceration, I was put into a position where someone acknowledged the fact that I was a leader.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge misconception about what this leadership training that Just Leadership is doing is about, because when most people hear leadership training, the connotation is that you don't actually know how to be a leader.
Yeah.
Therefore, you're coming here to learn how to be a leader or be an effective leader or to build on lacking leadership skills.
So why don't we? I don't mean to cut you off, but let me, because I want you to continue on that. But I want Glenn to come in here a little bit and talk about Just Leadership and the creation of Just Leadership and why this specific approach, which is the approach that part of the approach that you're talking about in leadership. So why this approach to criminal justice reform? You came from the Legal Action Center, spent time there, then you went and spent some time with the Fortune Society, actually as a vice president of the Fortune Society, and then after that, like something went off in your head and you're like, okay, no, it's time for Just Leadership. I think maybe it was because of I remember reading where there was an experience with you and your son Joshua, and you were like the kind of world that you want him to have.
Right.
But talk a little bit about that specific, unique perspective, analysis, and approach to criminal justice reform that comes from Just Leadership.
All right, cool. First thing I gotta say though is Khalil not the most humble cat you've ever met? Like an amazing leader, and at the same time just so humble, and I admire him for that. And so I appreciate all his kind words. But the truth is, I learned just as much from the leaders in the training as they learned from us. So I'd say about 2.5 years ago, I started really thinking heavily about where we were as a country on this issue. And we seemed to be having a series of moments, but it didn't feel to me like we were in a movement. But it did feel like things were lining up to get us there. And yet, at the same time, it felt that something was really missing. And I took a week off work, which is rare for me. I think it's probably the first week I took off in the 6 years I worked at the Fortune Society. And I hired a friend of mine who's a lawyer to sit with me and to really help me flesh out some of these ideas about what was missing in the field. And we came out with a concept paper, but I always talk about what that process was like, because I think that that's germane to where we landed in terms of our theory of change. One part is, I was sitting there with my son Joshua, and Joshua was 3 at the time. And, you know, we talk about cutting the number of people under correctional supervision in half by 2030, and, you know, that's when Joshua was going to be 18. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of symbolism in that for a black man growing up in America and trying to make it to 18 without being locked up. And so that was part of why I thought we needed a very ambitious goal, but for me, one that was also very personal, right? So how do you save the world and save a child at the same time? And I think everyone should have their sort of global reason for wanting to see mass incarceration end, but should also have their personal reason, because both of those things get me up in the morning and allow me to work the really long hours it takes to do what it is that we do at Just Leadership USA. And it was also the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So it was August 2013. And I just kept asking myself, like, you know, what would King be thinking right now? What would he be thinking about the sort of incremental approach that we're taking to a problem that is a juggernaut of a problem, if you will? And I think he would argue that we're never going to get to the finish line if we only chip away. I mean, I get that, you know, a million cuts got us here, and it's going to take a million cuts to band-aids to get us out of here. But at the same time, if you don't have a bold goal that people can sort of get behind, then we're never going to get to a tipping point. And what I've learned since then about bold goals is, first of all, that when you say something bold out loud, people tend to look at you like you have lost your mind, right? So that's where it started. People were like, well, first of all, you walked away from this amazing job that most people who serve time would be happy just to be in that position. And it was, you know, I loved working at the Fortune Society. It was a great place to work. I had a lot of influence there, a lot of access, a lot of resources. So it was a difficult decision, but in the end, the idea was this: how do I make it so that Glenn Martin is no longer the exception, right? Because that's what people kept doing. The same thing that they do to Khalil from time to time is people try to exceptionalize me. And I realized I was just exposed to a lot of exceptional opportunities. And so the question was, how do I do that for other people? Right? So it's not how do you find people and turn them into leaders. That's pretty naive. It's how do you find existing leaders and invest in them the way people invested in me, or the way I was able to access resources to invest in myself. I think it was a combination of those two things, because I think the field, unfortunately, hasn't been very deliberate about building a second bench of leadership. And I think that that is a failure of the field. I think it's one that the field recognizes, but it's a failure of the field. And so a year-long leadership training. How did we develop it? We developed it from scratch. We started out, you know, tabula rasa, like assuming we knew nothing about the people we hoped to serve. And what did we do? We listened. We found 60 formerly incarcerated leaders from around the country. We went to Columbia University and asked them would they help us do some research. And we interviewed those people, a couple hours long, and then we coded the interviews, and we learned some lessons about what people like me were exposed to, going all the way back to their childhood, that helped them to elevate as leaders post-incarceration. And we used that to develop this year-long curriculum. So we bring people to New York a few times a year. We pay for everything. The investment that the leaders make is their time, if you will. We pay for the travel, we pay for the hotels, we pay for transportation, we pay for food, lodging, and so on, because we want people to pay attention to the curriculum, to the opportunity to invest in themselves. And most importantly, you know, I say people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but never forget the second part, which is they're also furthest from power and resources. And so part of our training is not just building their capacity to be stronger leaders, but exposing them to resources and building their network. And I think one good example, and I hope Khalil will agree with me, was we had a panel discussion with the heads of 4 major foundations from around the country, including the head of the Ford Foundation. I mean, it took me a decade to get through the doors of the Ford Foundation, and I'm glad that they support us now. But, you know, when you think of the fact that people like Khalil have, you know, he doesn't just bring his story to the table. He brings his analysis to the table. He brings his experiential knowledge to the table. And yet, if he can't access resources, it's hard to take that from theory to fruition. And so we want to change that. And so that's a big part of what we do. And then finally, our year-long training is very competitive. So we have these emerging leaders trainings that we do around the country. We just did the first one in New York. It's a day long. 51 people attended, formerly incarcerated from 4 different states. And it's a chance for other formerly incarcerated people that may not have reached the level of folks like Khalil to have some level of exposure to our theory of change and what it is that we do to help strengthen leaders. And we're also a membership organization. We have over 11,000 members in 42 different states around the country. And the membership is only $12 a year, very deliberately, because we want people in prison, we want formerly incarcerated people to be able to afford to be members. It's only $1 a month. But for other people who have the ability to be a member for $12 a year and also give another $10 for a person in prison to be a member, we try to inspire them to do that also.
So Khalil, why don't you jump in here now? Your experience, your expertise, and now your work with Just Leadership. How has that been? Talk about getting involved in this approach and having that play out in your work.
Yes, I mean, as Glenn has mentioned, the main benefit, I would say, is one, the level of empowerment that the leadership training gives you to walk into these rooms understanding that in many ways you are the expert, that your experiential, that the fact that you live the experience gives you that right to say that you're an expert. And then access to the platforms and the resources. I mean, recently I was on a panel in Washington, D.C. with Glenn and Xavier McElroy Bay, all formerly incarcerated men were invited to this panel to talk about our experience. And while some may say, well, that's not what really changes hearts and minds. It doesn't really move policy. In reality, people are becoming more and more aware that if you're going to talk about solutions to a massive problem like mass incarceration, you need to have those directly impacted by the issue, not only involved in the conversation, but also dictating what will be talked about, dictating what the agenda will be, and so on and so forth. So for me, those are the two major things. The fact that I am empowered by not only the Just Leadership team, particularly Glenn, but also from the other cohort members. And I have 19 other people doing similar work, all formerly incarcerated, all have experience with the criminal justice system across the country.
Mm-hmm.
That's a network that has been given to me by my involvement in Just Leadership. And as Glenn mentioned, right, like he's streamlining the process because essentially what we need are all hands on deck.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, a million cuts, and like it's going to take a million band-aids, and one person or a group of people can't initiate those million band-aids. We need all hands on deck, and that's what the leadership training is really about. It exposes you to other people's work, and then in turn that becomes a wider network because you have access to their network. Some of the work that I've been doing recently within the last 4 months has been exclusively with Just Leadership cohort members. Yesterday I was at a presentation with one of the cohort members, Donna Hilton, and we were invited there through Just Leadership because of our experience.
Yeah.
Right? Because of our lived experience. So those are the two major things that I would say that I got out of Just Leadership. And then of course, and then I'm going to try to make Glenn blush here. Having a stronger relationship with someone that I totally admire.
Yeah.
And who in many ways inspires me.
That's a blessing. That's definitely a blessing.
Thanks, Khalil. I wanted to build out on something Khalil said was about hearts and minds. And so people minimize that, right? Like we think that the way to get out of this mess that we're in is strictly through legislative change or administrative policy change. Mm-hmm. But you know what I believe, and you know what my experience is, that ultimately people make decisions with their gut. Right? People, no matter how much you tell them about the cost, no matter how much you tell them about recidivism, all those things are important, and you tend to get a visceral reaction from people. When I say 100 million Americans have an arrest or criminal record on file, like people sit back and say, wow. And I would argue that if I asked them the question a week later, what did I say, they'll probably get the number wrong. Because in the end, whatever narrative people have going on in their heads, and if that narrative is that black and Latino men are scary and we should keep them away from us, then you can tell them we're spending $167,000 per bed per year on Rikers, and they'll just continue to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And so I think the way you undo that is to undo the stigma that they have in their minds about who it is that we lock up in this country, and who can listen to Khalil talk and not sit back and say, wait a minute, that's not fair. That's not right. Like, is that who we lock up? Is that what we turn people into? And hear his story of turning his own life around, if you will, or of redemption, or of just the power and gifts that he brings to the table, right? It's not just about keeping people out of prison, getting them a roof over their heads, getting them a job. Like, those things are important. I get it, Maslow's hierarchy. But people who we lock up in this country can also add value to this country. And we have to get to that level of conversation if we're going to turn this into a movement. And I want to believe we're in a movement. I know that movements are difficult to define when you're in the middle of them. So I keep waking up hopeful that we are. But I think that if we think that it's going to happen passively without us speaking up and speaking out loud and telling the truth, and saying things that make people uncomfortable, and reminding people with privilege that they have to not just identify their privilege and step away from it, but identify it and wield it. Yeah. You know, when I left Fortune, people say, well, how do you walk away from a job where you were doing so well and you had so much access to power? You know, I mean, there were meetings with the mayor where there's only me and 3 other people and the mayor sitting there in City Hall, and that's a pretty powerful position to be in. But how can I go around telling other people to wield their privilege when I wasn't thinking about what I would do with my own? And so leaving, you know, Joanne Page, who runs Fortune, says sometimes you have to leap and build your wings on the way down. And it was a bit of doing that in building Just Leadership. But I was hugely confident that I'd be able to build those wings before I crashed and burned, because because I put a lot of thought into this theory of change, and here it is almost a year later since we launched on November 12th of last year. And if you listen to Khalil's story, I can sit back and feel comfortable that this was the right thing to do. I think we're still learning lessons, but for Khalil's story alone, this would have been worth all the investment that I and others made to get this organization off the ground.
And in the little bit of time that we have left, and I knew we were never going to have enough time, definitely, an hour is not enough to spend with Glenn, so we're going to have to definitely schedule a part 2. But a message to the men and women who are locked up right now, because that's who's important to us. That's why we do what we do, because, we were there, and we're still, we're tridimensional beings. We live past, present, and future, so we're connected to them. And so what's the message for them regarding this movement? Because they also need to be involved in this movement.
Yeah. So we have a lot of people who are in prison who are part of our membership very deliberately, because I agree, when you lock up 2.3 million people, you don't ignore them as part of your base for reform. In fact, they have a huge amount of stake in the outcome. So I'll say that first of all. The second thing I'll say is around responsibility. If you're sitting in prison and you're thinking about what's next, particularly if you're short to come home, a big part of your behavior and what you do when you exit prison is going to help us either make the case for reform or help our opponents make the case for continuing down the road that we've been going now. So you have some individual responsibility to do the right thing or surround yourself with people who are going to keep you strong. And then lastly, don't ever doubt that you can be blank, and you fill in the blank. Whatever that blank needs to be. Whatever you want to be in this world. When I worked at the Legal Action Center, as a paralegal in particular, which arguably was the most important 2 years of my career, because I was listening to people who are formerly incarcerated every single day. And what I learned is that when people picked up the phone and called me and they wanted to be something, even if there was a statutory barrier, even if there was something in the law that said they couldn't do it, I would never tell people they couldn't do it. Because look at my story. I mean, I exited prison 15 years ago, $100,000 in debt, criminal record, barred by 50 employers, and then 7 years later, I was helping to run this organization that was serving 4,000 people per year. And I hope that serves as an example to people who are now sitting behind bars, whether they can achieve what they want to achieve. And then the last thing I'll say is, have a bold and audacious plan, but then have a few backup plans.
Yeah.
People come out and they want to change the world overnight. Don't forget, I didn't get here overnight. I remember living in the Bronx because I couldn't afford to live in Brooklyn where I grew up, and walking miles just to get to work because I couldn't afford money to get on the train while I'm watching everyone having all the nice things that I hoped to have before I went to prison, and just being humble about it. So, people see me now and they think I walked out of prison and walked right into this role. I struggled.
Yeah.
And so be prepared for that, have a vision and see yourself someplace better, but be prepared to struggle, because this is a very vindictive world, particularly for people with criminal records.
Khalil, literally 30 seconds, man, your message.
In 30 seconds, I would just re-emphasize the importance of individual responsibility. As Bruce said, I mean, the same way that people are going to hold myself and you and Glenn accountable for what we do and say as formerly incarcerated people, we also have to hold people in prison accountable for their behavior, because that's the one thing that the quote-unquote other side, or sometimes people even on our side, will then use to say, you see, look, are these the type of people that you're representing, or these is this the behavior that you're sanctioning? And the reality is that in many cases, damages the little incremental steps that are being taken. So, to understand that the best thing that they could do is understand they have a role, and to also be conscious of that role, particularly when it comes to behavior.
And we are out of time, but to contact and to get involved real quickly,
www.justleadershipusa.org or www.jlusa.org.
And I'm closing as we always close. Don't give in, don't give out, don't give up. Stand tall in spite of it all, and stay on the count.